All right, let's kick things off. So, warm welcome to everyone who is in the webinar, and a warm welcome to all those who will be watching this back later. My name is Adrian. I'm a clinical psychologist with GambleAware Blue Mountains, Western Sydney, and I am excited to have a Professor Michael Wohl today from all the way in Canada. So, thank you for making time later on your day. Michael and I briefly met at the National Association for Gambling Studies conference in Adelaide last year, where I was. It was a pleasure to hear him speak as one of our keynote addresses, and so I'm really excited to have him back for our little part of the gambling treatment and research world. And he's going to be talking today in some about nostalgia and how nostalgia can be both a force for good and a force to be overcome when we're looking at getting through something that's really hard for lots of people in our community across Australia and the world, and that is gambling. So after today, this will be uploaded to the Brain and Mind Center's YouTube page. That link has been at the bottom of all the emails that I've been sending you about today, but I'll send one again after today as a reminder. So that's if you need to leave early, if you're distracted or interrupted throughout, you can always go back and rewatch it. We encourage your questions and comments throughout our presentation. So if you have a question or comment, we prefer that you do it through the Q&A function. It makes it a lot easier for Michael, myself, and my team in the background to monitor and also to address it on the spot. At times as well, we'll be asking for your engagement and responsiveness, and you can use a chat function for that. And so Michael and myself will be able to see, what you're thinking about what we're presenting. Michael, well, as I said, he's from Canada, he's from Charlestown University. He, is part of the gambling laboratory there, which focuses on factors that predict disordered gambling, facilitators of responsible gambling, and the means to overcome barriers to behavioral change, which I think is going to be a part of today's presentation. He also has been exploring both the benefits and the potential drawbacks of reward programs and systems. So he's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers, which I think is more than I've read in my entire Masters of Clinical Psychology career. And he's received many awards, most notably the International Center for Responsible Gambling's Research Achievement Award. Is there anything to that you'd like to add, Michael?
That was wonderful. It's always interesting, these intros, this is your life kind of thing. That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So we're hoping to present for about 1 hour and leave the rest of the time for any questions or comments that we don't tackle along the way. And so at this point, I will hand over to Michael to kick us off.
Oh, thanks so much. And again, thanks for that intro. And it's an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. If there's one regret, it's that I'm not in Australia, one of my favorite places in the world to visit. And so if there's any opportunity, I will jump at it to come to your side of the world. Again, thanks so much for spending your day or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. These webinars can be a little bit odd in terms of like speaking into the void. As much as we can try to have some sort of engagement, let's try to do that. And part of that is that if there is a question that you have, please don't wait until the very end to ask it. I'm more than happy to interrupt myself, interrupt the discussion to answer your question, because nothing is worse than somebody asking a question about a topic that I covered 45 minutes ago, and then everybody's trying to kind of remember where I was at. So please do put in your questions into the Q&A. And I believe Simon is monitoring that and will interrupt me should there be a question there. All right, and I'm going to share my slide, and hopefully everybody will be able to see my title slide here. Is that correct? Can you see it?
I've got it.
Great.
I've got it.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, again, I'm really happy to be joining you, albeit virtually today, where I'm going to be taking you on a journey through some of my research, both past and present, which of course is a great segue into a talk about nostalgia. So we are only a handful of months out from New Year's. How many of you, if you can put into the chat function, and I'll try to take a peek, how many of you set a New Year's resolution? Just say why in the chat function if you did set a New Year's resolution this year. Or an N if you didn't, so that I know that you're paying attention. Thank you, Amy. Okay, so I'm seeing a Y, at least one. Yes, okay. Great. Awesome. Now, not everybody. Good. I'm seeing a number of you have set New Year's resolutions. Now, the next question that I have for at least the people who said that they set their New Year's resolution, how many people still have kept their New Year's resolution? How many people are still engaged in whatever they were resolving to do, whether it be exercise? No. I'm guessing still trying. Okay, that's an interesting response. Okay, so nope, but still trying. Okay, great. So listen, you are not alone among those who said that, that they set a New Year's resolution and that, that they're still trying or they haven't kept it. About 40 to 50% of American adult participants participate, sorry, about 40 to 50% of adult Americans say that they participate in this annual tradition of making a New Year's resolution. But only about 19% of those who set to resolve, okay, who set a resolution were successful 1 year later. Okay, so again, of the people, which it's about 50% of Americans say that they set a New Year's resolution, only about 20% of those are successful 1 year out. Okay, the actual rate of change of a particular behavior is lower because, of course, we're not taking into account the non-resolvers. Okay, so so when you think about behavior change, and even if you didn't set a New Year's resolution, there's probably some behavior that you engage in that you would like to change. Okay, but actual behavior change, engagement in that change, even if you resolve to change that behavior, is quite low. And when you think about people who are living with addiction, the rate of behavior change is remarkably low. Only about 1% of people engaged in addictive behavior seek treatment. Okay, so why is it so low, right? Well, let's face it, behavior change is really, really hard, especially for those who are living with addiction. Yet you would think that people who are engaged in addictive behavior, that that they understand the negative effects that addictive behavior is having on their life, whether it be familial strain, friendships ripped at the seams, job loss, financial hardships. One would think that if you're engaged in addictive behavior, gambling, for example, that you'd be running to change your behavior. You would do anything to change that behavior. However, this is not the case. And why might that not be the case? Well, much focus in the academic literature, okay, and among treatment providers has been placed in trying to understand the barriers to change. Why do people find it so hard to change, and what is impeding their ability to change? and what gets in the way of change. In fact, I would argue that at least in academia, okay, academics seem to be obsessed with the barriers to change. And maybe that's because it's easier to see and examine the hurdles to change than really trying to understand and motivate people to act differently. Okay? And that some of this research, okay, has been focused on negative self-perceptions. Okay, so when we're talking about why people don't engage in behavior change, a lot of this is about how people understand the self. And at least two of the factors that seem to be very prevalent in terms of barriers to change are shame and guilt. Okay, shame and guilt. Now, we tend to use these emotions interchangeably, but in fact, they mean quite different things. And if you dive into the academic literature on shame and guilt, people have very different definitions about this. I'm going to give you the definition that I tend to adhere to, which is shame is I'm a bad person, and guilt is I've done a bad thing. Okay? That they are very different things. Shame is a dispositional attribution. So again, I'm a bad person, whereas guilt is more situational, that I was in a context where I did a bad thing. Now, in terms of taking action, what we see is that about 85% of people who say that they feel shame, that they don't take action to change, and the same thing with guilt. Okay, so again, I'm just throwing this out there. I'm not going to get deep into this aspect about the barriers and shame and guilt. I just want to throw this out as one of the known barriers and to show you that, you know, we really do spend a lot of time both in the clinical world and in the academic world and the clinical academic world that we're looking at these kind of barriers. Instead of how to overcome them. And how do we overcome these barriers? Not surprisingly, one of the key factors that treatment providers do is they try to help clients change how they view the self, right? So trying to overcome feelings of shame, overcome feelings of guilt for engaging in the unhealthy or addictive behavior. In fact, many treatment modalities start with the premise that the true self can become lost when you're engaging in addictive behavior. People lose a sense of meaning, and that the loss of a sense of meaning in life can be a trigger for engagement in addictive behavior. They don't see their true self in the mirror anymore. And when trying to motivate people to change their behavior, they attempt to build a proverbial bridge to a more positive future by focusing people on perhaps their life goals, asking, who are you? And what do you want your life to look like? Okay. Let's take motivational interviewing as an example. Motivational interviewing is a treatment modality. It's one of the more popular treatment modalities used today. And much of motivational interviewing starts from the premise that people have resistance to change, and that the role of the treatment provider is to help explore discrepancies between one's behavior, the behavior that they're engaging in, it be it unhealthy, you know, addictive behavior, and one's goals. Okay, one's goals for their life. Okay, and that trying to resolve that resistance to change or that ambivalence to change by trying to highlight that discrepancy between one's behavior and their goals. You know, who are you really? How is your unhealthy behavior impeding your true self from coming to the fore? Okay. How is this traditionally done? You know, motivational interviewing is not alone in this, but a lot of treatment modalities, they start with, trying to get the client to reflect on who they are, their values. Again, building, trying to see the discrepancies between their current behavior okay, their current behavior, their present self, okay, and their future self. Okay? So starting off with the self-concept, that is, who they think that they are, understanding their self-schemas, that is, that organized body of knowledge that we have about ourselves, and thinking about their current behavior, their present self, and how what they want for their future, and how that removal of that unhealthy or addictive behavior can help them achieve that positive future. Okay. Again, to go back to motivational interviewing, a key component, it's written by those who, created motivational interviewing, is allowing the client to see how their problems might be at odds with their hopes for the future. Okay. A lot of focus is on the future. Okay. Now, this notion builds on the back of understanding that people have intimate knowledge about the self, okay, and that addiction derails the self, and that recovery entails striving to reconnect the self to who they've always wanted to become. Okay. In psychological jargon, okay, and in academic psychological jargon, and so for the academics or even the non-academics in this virtual space, that academics like coming up with fancy words, okay, where something for a very simple concept. And so in academic terms, we call this self-continuity, trying to build a sense of self-continuity. So what is self-continuity? Self-continuity implies that at the core, people have a fundamental sense of self. So here I am today. This is Michael Wohl today. This is Michael Wohl of like 5 or 6, and then Michael Wohl of about, 10, 12. Okay. And although I have grown and changed and learned things along the way, okay, that there's a core me, a core Michael that traverses time and space. Okay. And that sense of self continuity is can be gives you a positive sense of self. Okay. What addiction or unhealthy behavior does is that it creates a discontinuity. Okay, it fundamentally alters that. That addiction can radically or shatter one's worldview, shatter one's sense of self, and it creates a discontinuity in how one perceives oneself. Okay, and so through addiction, it undermines who you intend to become in the future. Okay, for myself, winning a Nobel in science. No, I just. But and so what the treatment provider is trying to do is reestablish a sense of continuity. Okay. And that there's a lot of research out there showing that people who have a sense of self continuity, that this can be trying to motivate people to reestablish a sense of self continuity, that this has a lot of psychological benefits. For example, research has shown that people who have a sense of self-continuity, that they have higher well-being, psychological well-being, a desire to achieve and maintain well-being, including, and so I'm going to underscore that achieve, right? So when you have a strong sense of self-continuity, and you realize that your addictive behavior is undermining that sense of continuity, right? Helping to reestablish that continuity can potentially motivate people to rid themselves of those negative, unhealthy behaviors that they're engaging in. And part and parcel of this, when people have established a sense of continuity, is that they have a higher sense of self-esteem. At some level, it makes intuitive sense that therapists would be focusing people on what the future might hold without, for example, problem gambling in their life. Okay, because people who feel continuous are happier and healthier. Okay? But there is a fundamental problem with focusing people on the future, especially people who are engaged in addictive behavior like disordered gambling. Can anybody think about what might the treatment providers think about, what are some of the issues that you might have had when you focus people on the future? Anybody? If not, I'll just jump to it. But what might be a problem when you think about your future? Okay. When you think about what your life is going to be like in 5 years, okay, do you have a sharp picture of what that is? The answer is probably no. Okay. And I love this quote from Darwin. As for a future life, every man must judge for himself between conflicting vague possibilities. The truth of the matter is, the future can be rather vague. Who might you be? Well, I know what I would like to be. Okay. How do I get there? I've got some thoughts about how I would get there. Now imagine you are somebody who is engaged in addictive behavior, disordered gambling, and you have somebody focusing you on the future without gambling in your life. Now, part of you thinks, oh yeah, my life would be better if I did not engage in this problematic behavior. Okay. But also, gambling there's a reason why you're doing it. There's a reason why you're engaged in the unhealthy or addictive behavior. Often it's a coping mechanism, right? So the future can also be really bloody scary for people when, yes, they know they need to, I'll use gambling as the example. They know they should stop gambling. They know that it's in their best interest to stop gambling, but a future without gambling in it is scary in and of itself, right? So when you're focusing people on the future, okay, it can be quite anxiety inducing. Now, what about the past? The past is concrete. Why is the past concrete? Because you've lived it. You know who you were in your past. You know what your life was like before you started gambling problematically. You know how you used to function. You know that you had more money in the bank. You know that your family, was functioning better, right? You had a job. The past is concrete. So perhaps what is needed is to highlight discontinuity between the present and the person you were. Okay? The person you were before you started engaging in this unhealthy behavior. And there is some research that hints at this, okay? That self-discontinuity may be, so focusing on how your present is different from your past, okay? That there's a discontinuity between who you are now and who you used to be before the addictive behavior entered into your repertoire can be quite motivating. There's anecdotal evidence from the clinical setting suggests that this disconnection between who you are now, the person you are, the person that is engaging in the addictive behavior, and who they used to be is quite motivating. Why is it motivating? Okay. Discontinuity or disconnection makes people long for the past, long to reclaim the pre-addicted self. Specifically, a sense of self-discontinuity creates nostalgic reverie for the past self. Within the context of addiction, what I've been doing in my laboratory is testing whether a sense of self-discontinuity creates nostalgic reverie, okay, nostalgia for the pre-addicted self, creates a longing for the past, which the literature in social psychology has been showing time and time again that a sense of discontinuity leads to nostalgia, okay? And that nostalgia motivates people to try to reclaim the past, okay? Let me give you a concrete example, okay? Myself, I have a son who is 9 years old, and he has far too many Transformers, okay? Why does my son have a lot of Transformers? Because I'm buying him a lot of Transformers. Why am I buying him a lot of Transformers? Adrian, since you can unmute yourself, why do you think I'm buying him a lot of Transformers?
I would have mentioned that you like Transformers.
Because I like Transformers, exactly. And so now I have a son who is the age when I fell in love with Transformers, and I'm buying him a lot of Transformers. I try to convince myself because I think he'll enjoy it. But let's be honest, I'm trying to recreate some of my youth. Okay. I'm trying to bring back my youth, right? I'm trying to bring back the past Michael into the present, and that the Michael in the present, if I give it to my son, now it's socially acceptable for me to play with Transformers again, right? So this is what nostalgia does. It's motivating, right? There's a reason why marketers tend to use a lot of nostalgia in their marketing, because they know that people who long for the past will be motivated to try to reclaim the past, okay? Now, often nostalgia is framed as a very negative thing. Okay. So just before this talk, I put into Google image search nostalgia, and this is one of the first things that came out. Okay. Intoxicated by memories and feelings. Okay. And in fact, if you look into the history of the word nostalgia, okay, it actually came from a Swiss a psychiatrist who was looking at um, the pain and longing that people in the army felt, right? And he really framed it as something really, really bad. Okay. That this is why, that they weren't fighting well, etc. Right? It's because they were nostalgizing. And that really carried into almost present day. For the longest time, nostalgia was seen as something that you wanted to avoid feeling. But at least within the social psychological world, spearheaded by Konstantin Sidakidis and Tim Wildschut at the University of Southampton, they started doing a lot of research trying to understand nostalgia, right? And they said, yeah, listen, nostalgia is not necessarily a bad emotion. In fact, it can be quite motivating, can be quite positive. And there's now a lot of research showing that people who nostalgize, okay, people who are nostalgic, that they experience positive affect. Think about it. When you're nostalgizing about your past, a positive aspect of your past, even though it's a bittersweet emotion because you no longer have that past, you're not living that past, the memories of that past are quite positive, right? And it creates a connection to that person in the past. Okay. So it increases positive affect, positive moods when you're nostalgizing, positive self-regard, a strong sense of belonging. It's been shown time and time again that when you feel nostalgia, that it increases a sense of meaning in life. Right? Why? Because when you're nostalgizing, you're like, oh, this is what's meaningful to me. Obviously, if I'm nostalgizing about it, right, it must be something meaningful. And what's interesting is that when you feel nostalgia, okay, even though nostalgia is typically produced through feelings of self discontinuity, when you nostalgize, it actually creates continuity because now you're remembering, it's drawing a connection to who you used to be, right? And again, it motivates a desire to reclaim that past, to bring that past into the present, right? I hate to use this other analogy, but think about Donald Trump and his catchphrase, Make America great again. Okay. What he's saying is that if you elect me, I can bring that positive past into the present. Okay. And I love this quote. Nostalgia is the suffering caused by unappeased yearning to return. For people engaging in addictive behavior, the desire to recapture the past may be beneficial. Okay, that's the supposition that I'm going to that we had, that I'm going to show you a lot of data that outlines this research. What is people who are engaged in addictive behavior, the nostalgizing, okay, is about the pre-addictive self, maybe motivating people to remove that addictive behavior from their repertoire, to reestablish a connection with the person that they used to be. Okay. So what we and my my colleagues did, specifically Andrew Kim, who some of you may know when he was my master's student way back when, and we started talking about the notion of nostalgia. And what we thought was, well, wait a second, maybe people who are nostalgic for the person that they were before they started engaging in the addictive behavior, perhaps that would motivate them to change their behavior. And of course, the antecedent for nostalgia is a sense of self discontinuity. That is feeling that the addictive behavior that you're engaging in is creating the self discontinuity. Right. So if you're feeling that sense of that the addictive behavior is creating a self discontinuity, that will elicit nostalgia for the pre-addictive self, which would lead them to be more ready to change their behavior. Now, I'm about to get into the data part of this presentation. And I know that not everybody in the room are necessarily comfortable with statistics. I've tried to minimize it as much as possible. If you don't understand what a p-value is or what a beta is, etc., don't worry about it. Just listen to my voice, and I will walk you through it and explain what you're seeing. What I'm going to show you is the first study that I ever did on nostalgia and behavior change with Andrew Kim. What we did is we recruited people who were disordered gamblers, okay, and we gave them a measure, an adapted version of a self-discontinuity measure that asked them the extent to which they feel that their disordered gambling is fundamentally altered who they are, right? And then we measured whether or not they're nostalgic for the person that they were before they started engaging in disordered gambling behaviors. And then we gave them a readiness to change questionnaire. And this is what we found, is that the more people expressed that they were experiencing self-discontinuity as a result of their disordered gambling, the more they reported nostalgizing about their life before they started engaging in disordered gambling. And that increased their readiness to change their gambling behavior. And we went, wow, that's amazing, right? Showing that just those kind of associations, because again, in the literature, there's very little research on what can push people to engage in behavior change. And what we're seeing is that nostalgia, okay, nostalgizing about the pre-addicted self might be that critical factor. Then in study 2, we said, okay, well, this is correlational, right? This is all correlational. What we need to do is we need to manipulate self-discontinuity. Can we manipulate self-discontinuity? Can we manipulate the extent to which people believe that gambling is fundamentally altering who they are? And if we can do that, will that then, in the discontinuity condition, will people who we manipulate to feel self-discontinuous, will they report more nostalgia than people who are in the continuity condition, right? And then will that nostalgia translate into readiness to change, increased readiness to change? Now, I'm going to show you the manipulation. Okay, there's a lot of text on the screen. If you want to read it, feel free. But the point of this is we gave them a fake news article, okay, reporting the results of a fake study in the New England Journal of Medicine that suggests that gambling can result in you losing your sense of self, okay, or does not change your sense of self, right? So there is the continuity versus discontinuity manipulation. We told people that either it can fundamentally alter who you are, okay, or it doesn't do that. And what we found, okay, first before I show you this, what the results, we did ask them to provide some open-ended, okay, so tell us how true this is for you. And those who are in the continuity condition, I'm just going to provide you some quotes. People said, gambling has eroded every fiber of my being. Before gambling, I was always happy. After entering the casino and winning my first night, it caught me in an endless cycle of pain. Here's some data slides, okay, for those who are into the data slides. What you see here is that those in the self-discontinuity condition reported more nostalgia for the pre-addicted self than those in the continuity condition, okay? What we also see is a lot more expressed readiness to change in the discontinuity condition versus the continuity condition. And then what we did is what's called a mediation analysis. What we found is that those in the self-discontinuity condition reported increased readiness to change through nostalgia. So those in the self-discontinuity condition reported more readiness to change, in part because self-discontinuity elicited nostalgia for the pre-addicted self, which then motivated people who want to reclaim that pre-addicted self. Okay. This is the fundamental model that we're going to be working with. Does anybody have any questions for me before I go and start talking about some of the limitations, some of the boundary conditions of this very powerful effect? I will tell you while I wait for somebody put something into the Q&A box that this effect, this relation between self-discontinuity, nostalgia, and readiness to change is one of the most consistent and consistently powerful effects I've ever worked with in my academic life, in my 26, 27 years. Yes.
So Michael, Kate in the Q&A just had the same question that I was thinking about. Kate's asking, have you had a look at the nostalgia people can have about early high point gambling? They create these golden memories in the recovery. And the quote from your previous slide, after entering the casino and winning my first night, ... Like we consistently see in our gambling treatment work that there are early positive experiences, that the level of detail that people can recall decades later, of those early wins. And Kate and I can share the same thing of how does that influence with this nostalgia?
Yeah. So what I'll say is understand that in these studies that I'm going to be presenting to you right now, these are not people in recovery. These are people who are actively engaging in the addictive behavior. So they're not necessarily nostalgizing about past gambling behaviors because they're still engaging in that behavior, right? But what I will say is very perceptive of both of you, because I'm going to be addressing that near the end of my talk, where one of the things that I've been doing of late is looking at nostalgia among people who are in recovery. And you are 100% correct that what we're seeing is that people who are in recovery from an addictive behavior, gambling included, do report nostalgizing for the perceived benefits of that they reaped from the addictive behavior. And I'll say stay tuned, to see what the results of that happen to be. But I think it's a great, I thank you for asking that, because I really want to make clear right now, what we're talking about is people who are still engaging in the addictive behavior, right?
If
And so does nostalgia move them to get ready to enter treatment or to engage in self-directed change? Go ahead.
There's also another comment just in the chat function before we might miss it. Someone's asking about the fact that for some people, their past self is extremely painful in and of itself. And what has your research kind of shown, if anything, about people whose past self, say pre-gambling, is still quite painful?
Again, another excellent question. And that is something that we're going to be addressing as we move on, the limits and boundaries of this effect. And what I'll tell you to sort of whet your appetite is a few years ago, I had the pleasure of speaking at a treatment facility in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, to people who are engaged in addictive behavior. Many of them had engaged in disordered gambling. And at the end of the talk, I had somebody come up to me and say, "This is really fascinating, but bullshit." And I'm like, "Oh, why is that?" And he's like, "Well, listen, my past was shit. I'm a shit person. There's no positive past to go back to." And so that really stunned me. I was like, "Oh, okay." And it took me a second. Then I thought, well, wait a second. Was there ever a time in your past when you felt safer or safe, where you were happier? And he stopped. He went, "Yeah, of course. There were times where, I'm happier. I was happier than I am today." I'm like, "Well, okay, what was going on in your life in that time that you were happier?" He said, "Oh, well, I had a job and I had a girlfriend. So yeah, I was happier." And I said, "And what about your gambling?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, I was gambling less." Right. So I think that most people will be able to find some point in their life where they felt safer, when they were happier. And the odds are, no pun intended, but the odds are that they were probably engaged in the addictive behavior less. Right? But later on in the talk, I will show you that we do not necessarily think this is a panacea, a cure-all. And so if you'll allow me, I'll move forward with the talk, unless there are other pressing questions.
The other two questions that are in our Q&A are very similar to the comment that we had in the chat function, looking at what are the people that have, really difficult lives already, pre-gambling specifically, for example, or even young people who don't have as much of a past self to anchor themselves to. So yeah, please do continue.
Yeah. So that's actually a very interesting comment that I'd just like to take just a moment to address, is that the benefits of nostalgia do not seem to be anchored by age, right? So I can ask in fact, my son, who's 9, often nostalgizes, right, about what happened last year or last week or last month, right? And so there are things about his past. He talks about, he's now nostalgizing about the winter because I build a little snow ramp for him. And actually yesterday, as I was driving out, he saw the sled in the garage. And he's like, "Oh, I guess I'm not going to be able to use that for, another 6-7 months." And I'm like, "That no, but you'll be able to use it again soon." Right. And so that's motivating him to now think about how he might change that toboggan run that I create in the back. Right. So age doesn't seem to really matter. We can all think about a time that perhaps was better for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So moving ahead, right? There's often a large chasm between recognition that behavior change is needed and making a change attempt. Right? Remember the New Year's resolution people, right? Just because you say you want to change doesn't mean that you do. So we needed to see whether people who say that they're ready to change actually change, what proportion. Okay. So yeah, change is the antithesis of addiction, is one of the famous quotes. So what we wanted to do next was see whether nostalgia is actually associated with change attempts. Okay? Not just readiness to change, but change attempts. And again, we recruited gamblers for this particular study, although we've replicated it with people who are engaged in other addictive behaviors, as you'll see later on. And so we measured problem gambling severity, manipulated self-continuity, discontinuity like we did before, measured nostalgia, and then we called them back a month later. Okay? And what we found, the first set of results, are among people who scored high on the PGSI. That is, people who scored one standard deviation above the mean in terms of their disordered gambling symptomatology. And what we found is this association. So in the self-discontinuity condition, they reported greater nostalgia. And then 1 month later, they reported that they had engaged, were more likely to say that they had attempted change than those who were in the continuity condition, right? Which is great. So now we're actually seeing that nostalgia can actually lead to behavior change, not just readiness to change, but actual change attempts. Now, among those who were low in disordered gambling symptomatology, we found no effect. Why might that be the case? Well, what we argued, the reason why we found no effect among those who are low in disordered gambling symptomatology is that they have no behavior that's in need of change. Right? They're gambling at recreational levels. So when we say that, gambling problematically fundamentally alters your sense of self, they go, okay, but that's not self-relevant, right? Because they're not engaged in that behavior problematically. Now, what we want to do next is see, does it replicate in a different addictive behavior? And so we looked at alcohol misuse, and we recruited 174 people who said that they consumed alcohol. And we gave them the audit, which is like the PGSI, but for drinking. And we did the exact same study. So everything, all the manipulations were exactly the same. We just swapped out gambling for drinking. Okay. And once again, we found this effect. Okay, so those who are high in alcohol misuse symptomatology, we found that 1 month later, those who were manipulated to think that alcohol misuse, right, fundamentally alters their sense of self. It elicited nostalgic reverie for the pre-drinking self, and we saw an increased relative to the self-continuity condition, more change attempts. And again, we found no effect for those who were low in disordered gambling symptomatology. Again, because those who were low, okay, aren't in need of changing their behavior, right? So when they read that problematic drinking fundamentally alters their sense of self, they go, okay, but it's not going to elicit nostalgia and it's not going to elicit behavior change because they don't have a behavior that's in need of change, right? So now I told you that I was going to get to that part of the talk where, I'm going to talk to you about some limits and boundaries of this effect. Okay. How much time do I have left, by the way?
Probably about 15 minutes to ensure we've got a good buffer of time for open-ended questions, but we can always adjust as
Did you
needed.
say 50 or 15?
15. 15.
15. Okay, then I'll go a little bit quicker with 15. All right. One of the theories that I find really fascinating is what's called implicit theories or mindsets. And what mindsets are is that there tends to be people exist on a spectrum from what's called implicit theorists to entity theorists. Implicit theorists are people who believe that behavior is malleable, right? That they can change their behavior. Entity theorists believe that behavior is fixed, right? These are the ones you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I am what I am. I'm not going to be able to change. Whereas other people, gravitate towards the idea that no, I can change my behavior. People are malleable. People can change. And so what we wondered is whether that link between nostalgia and attempted change might be moderated by implicit theories. That is, say you nostalgize for the pre-addicted self, but you don't think that people's behavior can change, then you're not necessarily going to make a change attempt, right? That motivating power of nostalgia may be undermined among those who have among the entity theorists, those who believe, again, that behavior can't change. And so we recruited disordered gamblers, about 250 disordered gamblers. Again, we did the same exact manipulation that we did before. Now we just measured implicit theories. And what we found is support for our what's called a moderated mediation model. And here I'm going to break down that part of the model where it's nostalgia to attempted change by implicit theories. Okay. What we found is that among entity theorists, there was a flat line. Okay. So meaning that it didn't matter whether or not they were high or low in nostalgia, right? That it didn't affect the probability of a change attempt. And again, because we argued that because they don't believe that people can change their behavior. So it doesn't matter whether they're nostalgizing or not, right? Because they're not going to necessarily engage in behavior change. Now, what's with the incremental theorists? We find, first, I'm going to focus you here. What we find is the greatest probability of change, of a change attempt, occurred among those who were high in nostalgia and believed that behavior can change, right? So when they're nostalgizing, they think, yeah, I can change my behavior. They are most likely to engage in behavior change. Now you might be looking at this and going, what's going on there, right? Why is the lowest probability of change occurring among incremental theorists who aren't nostalgizing? Well, what we argued is that this is likely because incremental theorists believe that they can change their behavior at any time, right? And that what they need is the push. And nostalgia provides the push to change. Without that push, they're not going to stop their behavior because they think they can change at any time. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now we're going to answer that question that was asked maybe about 20 minutes ago, also about, that people who don't necessarily have a positive past to go back to. I did provide some explanation for it, but what we wanted to look at is, okay, well, but are there people who maybe a future focused is better than a past focused? And there might be some people who a past focus is better than a future focus. And so what we did is we just asked people to write about their past. And what we found is that there were two groups, two clusters of people. People who spontaneously said that their past was better, and people who spontaneously said that their past was very difficult. And what we found is that longing, that nostalgia was greater for people who had a positive past. Okay, we found that for people who reported a positive past, they also felt more safety and security in that past. They expressed more meaning in life and a greater readiness to change because they spontaneously they thought about their past in a more positive way. We also focused another group of participants. We asked them to focus on a future without disordered gambling in their repertoire. And again, we found two groups. We found some who were very optimistic about the future, and we had some who were very ambivalent about the future. And what was the differences between these groups? Well, the people who were more optimistic had a more vivid future. They could envision the future more clearly, that they longed for the future more, that they felt more safety and security, more meaning in life, and a desire to change. Okay. So, what's the take home message here? Well, listen, nostalgia again may not be a panacea for behavior change. But what I would argue is that for the treatment providers in the room, or for people who are working with, in some other capacity, among people who are engaged in addictive behavior, disordered gambling, that, people who have a positive past, that nostalgia may be quite motivating, and it might be quite easy to get them, to motivate them to change their behavior because they have that positive past that's so easily accessible. But also, what I will say is that what we're showing is that you can also manipulate that, right? So even among people who do have a difficult past, what we find is that if you highlight a sense of self discontinuity, and if you can get them to find that aspect, an aspect of their past where they were happier, where they were healthier, they lived that life, right? So it's going to be a lot clearer for them and a lot more motivating for them than perhaps a focus on a possible future that they haven't lived, right? And that might be quite anxiety inducing. Okay. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'm guessing that I have before the Q&A, I want to turn your attention to one of the other questions that was asked about the longing for the perceived benefits that they gained from engaging in the addictive behavior. And that is, I want to focus on those who are in recovery. Okay? This is where a lot of my research attention is being directed these days. And I am not going to take credit for this line of research. I had a brilliant undergraduate honors student who came to me and wanted me to supervise their undergraduate honors thesis. And her name is Mackenzie Dawson. And she said, Michael, I've read your work on nostalgia and behavior change, but have you ever looked at those who are in recovery? Right. And she said, listen, there are people who probably have what she framed disorder related nostalgia. Okay. That is nostalgizing for, say, the thrill that they got when they gambled. Okay. For the escape that they felt when they were engaging. We know that that gambling, specifically gambling on electronic gaming machines, slot machines, pokies, they facilitate dissociation, right? And so people who have negative life experiences, one of the reasons why they like playing those games is that they lose track of time and space, right? It's kind of like when when you're ingesting a drug where you lose track of your current realities. That's something that people who are in recovery, she argued, would long for, right? And you'll see that we've done research with people who are in recovery from eating disorders. And what are some of the things that they are nostalgizing about? And what Kenzie argued is that this disorder related nostalgia, the nostalgizing about the addictive behavior, might pull them back to the addictive behavior. Right. And then she's like, okay, I think that might be the case, but a countervailing force might be optimism, right? So optimism about the future, optimism about repairing relationships, improved health, etc., for staying in recovery. And what she argued to me, and that we ended up doing a few studies, is that this is what creates ambivalence in recovery, is that push and pull between nostalgia for the past and optimism about the future. And so we recently published a paper where we examined just this. And in line with what Kenzie hypothesized, we did find a main effect of nostalgia. So the more that people nostalgized for the addictive behavior, um, the more they wanted to return to the addictive behavior. The more optimistic they were, the more that they want to stay on the path. And we found that there was an interaction between these two, such that the lowest amount of ambivalence about their recovery process occurred among those who were low in nostalgia and high in optimism. And what we argued here is that nostalgia is not a good idea. Nostalgia is not good, a good emotion to be experiencing among those who are in recovery, especially if the nostalgia is focused on the perceived benefits that they got from engaging in the addictive behavior. Okay. So next, we started looking at what is eliciting this disorder related nostalgia? What is bringing people to feel nostalgia? Okay. And one of the first studies that we did here is with people who were in recovery from an eating disorder. We focused on this because the prevalence is in the population is similar to disordered gambling. The mortality rate is actually quite high among people who are in recovery from an eating disorder and living with an eating disorder, and that recovery is quite poor. Right? So about 50% of people do not recover, even though they're in treatment. And here I'm going to turn the tables again. Whereas before we were saying, hey, nostalgia is a good thing, it motivates change. Now we're saying, hey, wait a second, but if nostalgia is focused on the perceived benefits of the addictive behavior, it's bad, right? And remember, we said, hey, listen, self-discontinuity is what elicits the nostalgia. Now we're saying, maybe it's continuity that's a bad thing. So remember, these are people who are in recovery, okay? To the extent that they feel connected to the person that they were when they were engaging, when they were in the throes of the eating disorder, okay? That's going to elicit nostalgia for the perceived benefits of the eating disorder. Okay, what might be some of the perceived benefits? The compliments that they got about their body shape, weight. Okay? And that to the extent that they're nostalgizing for the perceived benefits, that's going to undermine intention to remain in recovery. And that's exactly what we found. Right? Those who felt connected to the eating disorder self, nostalgized for the perceived benefits of the eating disorder, and that reduced their intention, okay, to remain in recovery. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I'll tell you where some of my research is currently at. If you happen to look at my CV, you might notice that I have 2 lines of research that run simultaneously that have very little to do with each other. And the other line of research that I look at is looking at intergroup relations, forgiveness, reconciliation, ethno-political conflict, and part of that is about identification with the social groups that we belong to. Okay, and what I've been showing in that kind of group level phenomenon is that to the extent that people identify, so Americans, especially American Republicans, who highly identify themselves as being Americans, they're more apt to buy into the "Make America Great Again," the nostalgia rhetoric. Right? So we thought, what about in the world of addiction? Do some people identify with the groups of people that are also engaged in that addictive behavior? And do they identify with the addictive behavior in and of itself, or the addictive substance? So the first thing that the first study that we did is that we looked at cannabis use disorder and recovery. Okay. And we looked at it, cannabis use, because cannabis is the most frequently consumed controlled substance in the world, with about 10% of people who use cannabis developing a cannabis use disorder. And when you look at cannabis use, you find that there are some people who use cannabis who very much identify with the substance, okay, with cannabis itself, right? So cannabis is an important part of their sense of self. And so what we wanted to look at is, does the extent to which you identify with the addictive substance lead to nostalgizing for the benefits of the perceived benefits of that substance or behavior? And then does that influence intention to remain in recovery? And once again, we found, this kind of association now with identification with cannabis eliciting nostalgia. So these are people, and by the way, we've just recently replicated this with people in recovery from a gambling disorder. So there are people who very much identify with gambling, right? Being a poker player, right? That this is a core aspect of who they are. And that when they are in recovery, to the extent that they identify themselves as as a gambler or identify with cannabis, what we see is that elicits a nostalgic reverie for engagement in the addictive behavior, and that undermines recovery. So what should you be taking from this presentation? What are some of the take-home messages? Well, if you're interested and want to learn more, we recently published a systematic review looking at the utility of nostalgia for unhealthy populations. Okay? And I'm happy to send it to you if you can't, if you don't have access, you can't get access to the paper. But briefly, what did we find? We found that along the lines of what I've been telling you today, nostalgia can facilitate healthy behavior change when it's focused on reclaiming the life that was lived before the unhealthy behavior began. But we also found a second theme in the literature, and that was that nostalgia can undermine healthy behavior change when that nostalgia is about the perceived benefits that they receive, that they gained from engaging in that addictive behavior. So nostalgia can be both good and bad for one's health. But at the end of the day, I'm hoping that you can, one of the take-home messages from this talk is that perhaps there's been an over-reliance on focusing people on the future. That there does seem to be behavior change utility in focusing people on their past, specifically the past that they lived before they engaged in the unhealthy behavior, or a part of their past when they were happier and healthier. Why? Again, the past is concrete. People can remember what their life was like, and that can be leveraged to facilitate behavior change. The future hasn't been lived yet. It can be very vague and very anxiety provoking. And I'm sure that the treatment providers in the room have many examples of when they are with clients and talking about the future without the addictive behavior, right? And seeing their anxiety levels rise. And perhaps that can be bypassed by leveraging the past. So I'm not doing this research alone. There's been a lot of people involved in this research over the years. Here's some of the names. I can't take credit for it, especially this whole line of research about the past. And I do have a grant proposal that I'm currently writing with Kath Haslam at the University of Queensland, where we're going to be looking at social groups and the extent to which recovery is in part, this is building off of that last study that I just presented to you about identification with the addictive behavior, the addictive substance, And part of that identification is because of the social groups that you are a part of that also use that substance, right? Or engage in that behavior. And part of the recovery process is shifting the social groups that you're a part of and shifting the level of identification that you have with social groups, with people who are a part of social groups that are engaging in that unhealthy behavior. And what we have some preliminary evidence is that the more that people shift towards social groups that don't engage in that addictive behavior, nostalgia for the perceived benefits of that addictive behavior decreases, which helps facilitate the recovery process. So with that, I'll stop talking and hopefully open up the floor for some discussions.
So thank you. Thank you for that presentation, Michael. And certainly have things churning over my head. And I might actually start with this comment while people want to put any questions or comments they have in the Q&A function. The lens that I am looking through this presentation today is the group of people in recovery, right? As a clinician, I'm largely engaging with people who have, put their hand up and reaching out for help. And something that we're really mindful in our treatment program is, we're looking to use the word discontinuity, is that nostalgia for past moments in the gambling history does not align with what we call the objective value of the game. In other words, early winning experiences, big wins along the way, do not align with the inherent, unfairness of whether it's poker machines or blackjacks or lotteries or sports embrace rating. And that's something that's really important to unpack and help clients process, because while they're longing, for these moments in their past gambling history, they are skewed. It's not the full picture. Is that's not necessarily going to translate into the future, and then looking through that lens just builds the harm slowly and slowly and slowly more so in the future. So that's something that really jumped out to me as you were talking towards the latter part.
Mm-hmm. And exactly, I think that nostalgia has some utility, but you have to be cognizant of what they're nostalgizing about, right? And this is one of the things that where I've sort of marked my territory in the nostalgia literature is that I always bristled at the nostalgia literature because they would be asking questions like, "Do you nostalgize for your past?" And I was like, well, but what past are the content of nostalgia matters, right? So I would say in recovery, and we also have what I'm about to say, we do have some evidence that people who are in recovery also nostalgize for the pre-addicted self, right? And that can help minimize the ambivalence that they have about staying on the recovery path. Is that can help keep them on the recovery path, is remembering, right, my life is slowly getting better, and maybe saying, remember what your life was like before this behavior became problematic. Do you see that slowly starting to come back, right? That you're rebuilding relationships, perhaps not with the same individuals, right? There might be individuals from their past they simply can't, for whatever reason, maybe divorce, whatever. Maybe you can, help recreate a more positive relationship. But with that person's ex, but shifting the nostalgia, if they express nostalgia for the addictive behavior, say, but what else are you nostalgizing about? Do you think about what your life was like before you started engaging in this addictive behavior? And do you see some of that, you reclaiming some of that past through this recovery process? Yeah. Well, guess what? The longer you stay on it, the more that past, what you used to live, the way that you used to live, will start coming to the fore again.
Yeah, and it's a really great point because, again, lens of working with people in recovery, you hear the changes session by session, as they as a disconnect, right, from the present self, traction towards gambling, their, core motivations. Inadvertently, they start to reclaim parts of themselves. And an example just pops in mind. I was working with a client only earlier this week, and they're towards the end of our treatment program, and has been making some awesome gains. And they were talking about how they've started exercising again at a gym, and that was something that was really important to them pre their gambling history. The irony is the gym is across the road from the pub that they used to gamble at, and they can see part of the pub through the gym. And it's just interesting how their mindset has totally shifted to the point that it's, no, the self that I'm really working on now is pre the actual gambling self, even though I can physically see part of it. And it was just a really great example of reclaiming the self once they'd worked out that there's no real value to gambling. Like, there's nothing good's going to come from walking in the venue across the road, but something good can happen from me staying at the gym.
Yeah. And there may be some utility in both saying, yes, this is that now that gym self, right? It's not just a new self, it's reclaiming your past self, right? And that casino self, that's that's not really right. That's what created the discontinuity, right? That now that you're in the gym again, you've reestablished continuity with your true self.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if there's any questions or comments, please put them in. We've got a few more minutes. Again, though, I kind of speak to, what we do in our work, and I guess kind of how it match up, looking at this sense of the past self pre-gambling. Early on in our program, we'll do like a bit of an exercise with clients where we'll get them to think back to sort of the earlier years, like the recreational years. We'll get them to reflect on more recent time, but again, all past, to kind of compare the harm and how it's changed. And I'll spring on them at the moment. I said, actually, can we talk about your life before your first ever gamble on the pokies, your life before your first ever gamble, on blackjack, your life before you went to the race course, with your dad at age 16. And, the worksheet changes completely. The content changes completely. We're no longer talking about how often they were gambling and how much they were losing and the harms of life. It was like, oh, it wasn't part of my life, and I was doing this instead. And you made the comment of, it doesn't really matter for age. We can work with some very young men, in particular in the early 20s, who can still remember life as a teenager. And I can similarly work with very old people in their 70s who can still remember life 50 plus years ago. And so even very early on, we're really trying to anchor people to that. Yes, there is a past selves within your gambling journey, but there is a past self pre-gambling too, and that's just important.
And my guess is that you'll be able to see some physical manifestations of the nostalgizing, where they'll start smiling and they'll probably like their eyes going up and like thinking about it, right? And if they're nostalgizing, it's that nostalgia is a bittersweet emotion, right? It's sweet in that you're having these positive feelings about the past and remembering. It's bitter because you're not there anymore, but it's motivating. Right. And so telling people, use that, use that happiness, right? You can reclaim that again. Or by staying in recovery, staying on the recovery path, you'll be able to relive some of those. You'll be creating new memories, but it's you're bringing that person back to the present that you're longing for.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Again, the client that, a very sort of typical example, a migrant, to Australia, no gambling at all in their home country, comes in and, continues life, and just along the way somehow, finds himself in a pub, wins money in a poker machine, and years later ends up, talking to me. And yeah, when we're doing that same activity, talking about, yeah, when I first came to Australia, I was in my community and we were doing all these cultural events and I was learning so much. And you could just visibly see their eyes just widen, thinking about that past self.
And then when you think about what leads to addiction, right? Or one of the big predictors of disordered gambling is an early big win.
Mm,
Why? Because people are nostalgizing about
yeah,
the high,
precisely. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's so vivid that every time they play, they're longing, they're sentimentally
Mm,
longing for that experience and all the benefits that came around it, right?
mm,
Telling everybody being excited for them being on a high, right? My guess is that those who have an early big win are probably nostalgizing a lot, right, about the perceived benefits that they got from
yeah.
gambling.
I would agree. It's certainly reflected in the breadth of clientele demographics and types of gambling I've seen over the years that I've worked in this space. They certainly, it starts like a deeper attraction towards gambling over other things. In other words, they no longer looking towards the past self and the attraction towards that past self. It's attraction towards the past gambling and what that gambling
Yeah.
achieved.
And remember that at the heart of nostalgia, one of the outcomes of nostalgia is a desire, a motivation to bring the past into the
Yeah.
present. So if you had an early big win, why do you keep gambling? Because you're trying to recreate that
Mm.
again,
Yeah,
right?
and along the whole way, not understanding that the game isn't, designed
Exactly.
that way. That the game
Yeah.
isn't designed to keep giving you big wins. The game is actually designed to take a lot more from you along the way, and hence harm perpetuates.
Yeah. And with those individuals, you might be able to redirect the conversation to, okay, but what was life like even before that?
Mm,
Right? What was life like? But now that you experienced, gambling related problems, right?
mm,
Yeah, certainly you had that one experience, but look at what's happened as a result. Okay, what about your life beforehand? And redirecting the nostalgia to what
mm.
life was like before gambling entered into their life, right? So
Yeah.
that they're nostalgizing about something that will motivate behavior change or keep them on the path of recovery, as opposed to the nostalgizing. You want to try to nip the nostalgizing
Mm.
about the addictive behavior in the butt, right?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
as quickly
agree.
as possible, right?
Well, we've coming to the end of today. So what I'm going to do, just a couple of wrap up matters. Was one final comment in the Q&A, and I reflect Viv's sentiment. An extremely enlightening and insightful presentation, Michael. I certainly resonates with what we do when we're working with the people trying to better themselves. And I'm sure it does so with a lot of other participants today, and even those who aren't treatment providers themselves, but work in gambling and other aspects. It helps paint a richer picture of the people that we're trying to all improve the lives of. So from today, there will be a recording on the Brain and Mind Center website. So if you've missed part of today or you're interrupted, you can go back and rewatch it. I will also send out a couple of papers related to what Michael has been speaking about today. So if you want to do a bit of extra reading and deep dive, that's be a starting point. Let everyone that's still here know that we'll probably have at least 2 more journal clubs throughout the year. Hopefully one in person during GambleAware Week once the OIG provides more details about when that's going to happen. So stay tuned. Otherwise, thank you for your participation. Thanks for joining. And just let you know, Michael, when we end the sorry, something's stuck in my throat. When we end the webinar, it ends pretty abruptly. So everything sort of closes down. So just want to say again, thank you so much, and all the best for your work up in Canada.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for the invite, and thank you everybody out there for tuning in.
All right, have a lovely day. See ya.
You all.